So my initial experience with the EZX system was pure pessimism, as most things that I see for the first time. It didn't look like anything that I had seen before in the operating room. In fact, it kind of looked like one of those crazy creatures from the movie Tremors in sci-fi, rather than something that would help me remove a well-fixed acetabular component. And the other thing that my initial impressions were was that I had previously used, the rotating osteotomes that are manual and basically rotating around the ball. There's several different manufacturers that make them, and I hadn't really had a whole lot of trouble with them. So why would I want to switch to something else? I mean, as I did it, every time I was a little bit worried that something terrible would happen in the acetabulum, but it I had never really reached the point where I said, well, I need something new. And then one of my partners suggested to me that I try the EZX system. And it was someone that I trusted, and he had had good experience with it. So I tried it out. And, on thinking of it more, we have different tools that we use in the operating room. And we classically, probably over the last decade and a half, have used these rotating manual osteotomes, which is essentially a chisel. And what the EZX is and why it looks different is it's not a chisel, it's a saw. And a saw at times can be a much more precise instrument. In fact, it's a series of chisels. So, I mean, it's a much more refined instrument. And there's some serious advantages to using a saw over a chisel, and one of which is that the blade of the saw can be much, much thinner than that of a chisel because it's cutting through and removing a small area of wood or bone, as opposed to a chisel, which has to drive in between and actually kind of slice in and wedge. It's a wedge. It wedges in between those fibers. I think of it akin to something like drilling a pilot hole in a piece of wood before you put a screw through it. If you just put that screw through, sometimes it'll be okay. Sometimes it's going to crack that wood. If you drill a pilot hole to make room for that screw, then it's less likely to crack. And that's essentially what the EZX does, is that by removing a small area of bone that from the kerf of the saw all the way around that acetabular component, we're able to not use excessive force, not wedge a chisel in between there, but rather remove that bone all the way around it, which I think is a very precise and low force way of doing it, which has a lot of benefits, particularly when the acetabular component's really up against cortical bone. Cortical bone doesn't like to be compressed very much. Cancellous bone, you can kind of cut through with an osteotome. Cortical bone, much better to remove that. When we're doing total knees, we don't make our cuts with a chisel, we make them with a saw. And so it makes a lot of sense to use a saw. So I'll give a couple of cases here today. This is the first one I had. It was a 62-year-old female that presented to me from one of my partners who does the posterior approach. And she had had a previous direct anterior total hip replacement. She actually fell on a cruise ship and then presented several weeks later. She had a hybrid total hip done and 4 anterior dislocations in the 4 months post-op. So she was referred to me for consultation and revision. Here are her pre-op x-rays. This is a supine film, and there's one of the dislocated anteriorly in the emergency room. It's important just to kind of know that it's a supine pelvis, but a couple of things to consider when I'm thinking about revising someone who had a femoral neck fracture. This is not an arthritic hip, so it doesn't tend to be sclerotic bone. You can even see the amount of bone loss that she has just from her osteoporosis around her acetabular component. So there's not going to be that same sclerotic rim of bone around this. It's going to be soft osteoporotic bone, and she does have a well-fixed cemented stem. So looking back at her x-rays, her acetabular component, if we get her a supine film, we can see, I mean, her leg lengths and offset actually are pretty appropriate. But if we get a standing film, we can see that the tip of the pelvis with her standing leads to significantly more anteversion. In this case, it's probably about 35 degrees of anteversion, which is why she's dislocating anteriorly here. So anytime we have a revision for instability, we try to figure out what's the cause, what's the story for this. And then if you understand why something is dislocating, then it's much easier to treat it. And so in this case, we know we need an acetabular revision. And this is pretty much real time here. I'm going to pause it for just a second. You can see I have one retractor here, inferior, it's on the left of the screen. That's underneath, right above the TAL, and then the trunnion is being held out of the way by a bone hook here. I find that whatever you can use to kind of keep that trunnion out of the way, protected from the blades, is going to be much better, sometimes even than using a retractor, because it's going to keep it away from the acetabular component. So we kept working, and on this case, I'm using it on ream instead of drill, and that's because we really need the torque of that drill to do this. And bone hook kind of popped off the trunnion right there, and you can see the cup's going to start moving right now. We're basically all the way done.
There it is. Got it.
And it really doesn't require a whole lot of force. I mean, really, you're steadying it, but you're not applying that same rotational torque force that you have to do, or impacting in an osteotome through this bone. So then we return to our revision here. We're able to upsize. So that was a 52 cup, and we went up to a 58 cup with a 56 reamer. I tend to undersize my revisions just to get a little bit better of a press fit. She got a great press fit there. And then here's our final x-rays, much more appropriate anversion and position the acetabular component, some screws to kind of help us with that initial fixation so that she can ingrow. And then she had a stable hip post-operatively and went back to all the things that she liked doing. Her leg lengths were still relatively stable. I think we ended up putting in a zero head on her, and she gained a little bit more offset from this. But in the case of revision for instability, offset is your friend. The next case here is a patient of mine. This is the one we hate to see. This is a 61-year-old female patient of mine. She presented with AVN, osteonecrosis of the femoral head, and she unfortunately started draining at 10 days post-op. It stopped, and then 4 weeks post-operatively, it started again. So we tried a debridement and implant retention. Unfortunately, she continued to drain. So 2 weeks later, we chose that we had to explant this and place an antibiotic spacer. So here we are in the operating room. Again, you can see she has a pretty large body habitus here, but we're fitting the spacer in there in the liner. So, and I always find, I think when the first couple of these I did, I worried that if that liner wasn't 100% perfectly sized, that something terrible was going to happen. It's really a little bit more intuitive than you kind of think. So, you want it to be flush with the cup, and you don't want it to kind of shuck around. But as long as it's in there and it's holding that thing centered, it's really going to work. So, I mean, you probably could go up one or down from the perfect position, and it would probably function just fine. So here we are, we sized it, and it's just kind of sitting there. It spins pretty freely. I've just got the suction in there, and you can kind of line it up. It spins pretty freely in there. It's not stuck in there. It's not binding. It's not sitting too low or shucking around. So it really is just flush with the rim, and that's kind of what we're looking for there. And again, we slip this in. This is done direct anterior. The femoral component's already removed at this point. And so in this case right here, we actually removed all of the retractors because the blade wanted to keep hitting these retractors because of her body habitus. And so we knew, I mean, that blade is so low profile and it really has nothing sticking out to wrap up anything. So once you expose the rim of the acetabulum, you can take out all the retractors. I mean, you can put a self-retainer or something in there, but you really don't need any retractors in there. You can just trust. And he can look down. It's actually my fellow doing this, and I was videotaping him. He can actually look down, even though it doesn't look like it. You can see into there, and you can see just the edge of the acetabular component and see that liner is still seated perfectly and that you're staying perpendicular to it. And if you can't, then, you put in some type of self-retainer or one retractor kind of over the anterior column, just out of the way so it's not going to hit the blade, so you can get a view of that. So here's the final product here. We removed the stem. We had to cut the collar off to do it. And after we'd removed the acetabular component, really no work needed to be done on that acetabulum to be able to put a liner in. So the acetabulum is debrided by the saw. So it's cutting off that layer of bone surrounding the implant. You really don't need to, I don't think you need to ream any further, particularly if you're doing a spacer. So then I immediately just go to my spacer. I'm able to put that liner in after all of my washes and I change my drapes. Um, and we can just place that spacer in and not have to do any additional reaming. Here's a couple of cups that are removed, and that 54 in the top left corner, probably too over because it has a little bit of bone, especially at the edge there. But really, when you look at these, they're really not a lot of bone surrounding this. I mean, the bottom right and bottom left ones probably have a millimeter of bone surrounding the implant. So if you kind of think about that, that's probably sized over 2 or 3 millimeters over the size of the cup, which still much less bone loss than we would be experiencing with other systems. And it's done significantly faster with significantly less force. And to me, that's really the thing that changed my practice was it's significantly less force, it's much more precise, and essentially it's easier. I think realistically, in my opinion, in the next 5 years, this is going to be the standard for removing acetabulum components in the United States.